Doing things a little out of order this time. This is actually the end product of this project. So this is how I got everything converted over to mechanical controls. This is all of the HVAC controls for the car now are all here. And here are the lights for the HVAC controls. The camera doesn't really know how to focus on it, but kind of get the idea of it. All right, so next part of the video will be, how did we get to this? All right, so I've been trying to get the dash back in the car, and in order to do that, I have to get all of the HVAC components back in. The problem is the original design has this slick little deal here, which is pretty cool because you look at the top of it, as you move this to select different deals, it rotates that guy. And what that does is it supplies or releases vacuum on these different lines based on that position, which then runs to various little vacuum solenoids. It's a simple system. It's actually a pretty decent system. The problem is, as far as I can tell, no company makes these new. And my parents have a 86 and an 87 300, and both of those cars have problems with the HVAC controls because these diaphragms leak and they're coming apart. And the 86 is to the point that the heat is pretty much stuck on all the time. It just is basically a big vacuum leak at this point. So all of these actually checked out as good with the exception of this one. But I know at some point all of these are going to quit working, and then I'm going to have a problem that I'm going to have to deal with. So while the car's all apart, I figured I'd rather deal with the problem now. All right, so there's a decent bit to look at here. This is that center section that has all of the dampers in it. So it's like there used to be a vacuum canister here. That little one that's dead used to go right there. There was another one right here. So those vacuum canisters all pulled on this and made it do different things. And what I'm trying to do is get away from that and go with a mechanical design, because in theory, an all mechanical design should always work, or if something does happen with it, it should be relatively easy to deal with. So, in brief, what I have done is I added this little piece of bracket here, bolts right there in the factory hole. That was just to get on the other side of the pivot point. That runs up to this cable, which is just fitted loose. We'll get back to that, which uses one of these original, whatever you want to call it, linkages. This end here would have originally attached to one of those vacuum diaphragms, but I have it on here. Little clip, original clip holding it in. This I actually need to take off. That was a failed idea. This linkage here runs down to this damper piece of wire. It's wrapped around it in such a way that it keeps it all from coming apart. I went ahead and put some tape on there and labeled what each position does just to try and make it more clear. And so this diagram was incredibly helpful in figuring all of that out. This is straight out of the factory service manual for the 1983 280ZX. So really, this diagram that tells me which damper is doing what was really what I needed to try and sort this out, because otherwise it's kind of difficult, or at least it was for me. So I wanted to do something similar to this, and I liked how they did this interesting design. If you notice, it's not just pinned back here, it actually slides. You can see that. And this track is what guides it. The benefit of doing that is instead of this whole thing swinging out so much, it stays much closer to the actual face here. So I wanted to try and mimic that because I thought that was a much cleaner way of doing it. And then the other thing I noticed about this is this really isn't that big. In fact, I compared this to an aftermarket radio that I have, and an aftermarket radio should be able to fit where this guy did, because the original radio for these cars was fairly substantial, and it took up that whole base section of the whatever center dash area. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the radio where this thing went, and then I'm going to put all my HVAC controls in the big area where the factory radio used to go, and that'll give me a lot more room to, you know, to work with, really. All right, back over here. So if you run this damper here, that is the floorboard. If you run it to about the middle there, that's where you're getting into the defrost. If you run it up here, this is where you begin sending air back up here to the dash vents. But the problem is that's where the travel of this thing stops, because it closes this damper right here, which forces hot air back up this way and out the dash vents. So this guy can't move anymore, but right now it's actually bi-level. It's doing, pushing air out of here for the dash vents, but then this guy here grabs some of that air and runs it back down towards your feet. But I didn't have any way, I mean, this is at the end of its travel. I can't do anything. So I needed another damper, another way of moving that to that position where it goes full dash vents, closes the bypass for the floor vents, which is where this cable comes into. It goes ahead and takes up the slack, you can see. And that spring is just hanging out. It's not actually hooked up to anything. It's another thing I need to take off. Then we come back down here. It's back to defrost, floor vents, defrost, going back up to bi-level. And this nightmarish looking thing is what I came up with. So I don't even want to think of how much time I have in this, because pretty much all of this I made out of sheet metal. So it was not a small undertaking, but the way that this works, I'm going to use paper towel here because I pretty much rubbed my fingers raw messing with this thing over the last few days. So you can see this design here was inspired by the original design. So I have that slot there, so this can slide back and forth, which keeps this close. It's not as good as the original design, but it keeps this thing from swinging way out in the middle so bad. So it's got a pin that runs all the way through it that's welded. And based on where this is at, it either grabs this bottom piece, whatever you want to call it, this bottom linkage, or it grabs this top one. So if it grabs the bottom one, it runs that cable. And if it grabs the top one, it runs this cable. So these guys here, what it is, put a picture of it up, is it's actually a bolt. I drilled a hole through, and then I took a nail, welded a little nut to the end of it, and then I took a section of bolt. I took the shoulder of a bolt, cut it off, welded it to the end of the nut so that it basically made a pin, and I put a spring in there so that this is spring loaded. So when this releases, it shoots that pin down and grabs this linkage to keep it from moving out of position. So that way, when you bring it back to the neutral position, you grab the next piece and drag it over. And there you can see the pin locking that bottom linkage in place. And then you can see the faceplate here kind of makes this little pattern, which guides the actuating rod. So it took a lot of time to make. It's not as good as I really wanted it to be, but it's probably about as good as it's gonna get. And then I used engine assembly lube as a grease on all of this, which seems to have worked pretty good. This bolt here has a lock nut on it, so that way it doesn't back off, because it has to stay loose so that this thing can move up and down. So this one is going to take care of this, which this I think was the hard part. And then I got to fix this. You know, I cut this because I tried to make a different heater core work out of I think it was like a Camaro or something like that. Realistically, wasn't ever going to work. I found a shop that supposedly is fixing the original heater core, because this actually had a pretty nice heater core in it. I was shocked, apart from the fact that it had a tube blown out of it. And then the car came with a spare heater core, and of course that one was broke too. So I'm working on trying to get a heater core for it. Of course, nobody makes an aftermarket one for these things, so I'm really hoping that this shop can fix the original one. So that'll sort out the heater core. And then the running the lines is going to be a challenge. I was trying to avoid having heater core lines in the car, but I really don't think there's going to be any way around that. But anyways, that is this portion of the mess. So what you definitely could do is these cables are just generic choke cables. I don't know, got them through Jegs or something like that. Oh, here's the end of one of them. So just a generic choke cable. If you wanted to, you could definitely just leave this end on there and run this into some kind of a metal dash panel that's capable of supporting it. And it would work just fine with that. The trick with it is you're not going to have an interlock that runs them back to a neutral position. So it would be up to you to figure out, you know, okay, hey, I need to push this one in and then pull this one out, which wouldn't be the end of the world, not too complicated. So this is definitely overkill. For what I want and what I envision this thing being, this is what I wanted to go with. You could definitely just go with something like this and get a similar result, although not aesthetically pleasing, but it would still work. So come back later when there's something else going on. I got this apart again. So all the foam that was in here was just totally falling apart. It was just disintegrating anytime you touched it. So I got this stuff, whatever this foam weather stripping tape. It's 3/4 inches wide, 1/4 inch thick. And I've been putting that around the dampers to kind of do the same thing as the original foam did, which is just make sure that the damper seals up with the plastic housing and it doesn't leak air past it where you don't want it. And then I use some of this random, it's not epoxy, whatever you want to call it, glue. I put some of that under this stuff as well. It has its own adhesive, but I added some of that just to hopefully make sure it sticks. I wire wheeled down where I put this stuff, and then I cleaned it off with lacquer thinner. So before I get that put back together, revisiting the heater core. So this is the original heater core to the car, and it had a tube blown out of it. I tried fixing it, and it was a hopeless failure. Fixing these is an art, and it doesn't matter how easy it looks online, it's not easy. So after I just made a bigger mess of it than it already was, I took it to a actual radiator repair shop that does copper radiators and stuff, and it was like $200, and they fixed it, put a whole new core in it, and it looks really, really good. I mean, it's pretty much looks brand new as far as I can tell. But yeah, and then the heater core, so it has this foam that goes around it, which I think survived decent enough to reuse. So the heater core pops in here with that foam around it. And that way I can put this guy back on, get it all put back together. All right, since the AC system on the Blazer hasn't beat me up enough, I decided to mess with the one on the 280 just a little bit. This looks like some kind of space-aged nonsense. I have no idea why it's built the way it is pretty much the bottom line. This is the expansion valve. This is the suction throttling valve right here. Very basic understanding of how these work. And all that is just from reading the factory service manual, but short summary of that. This suction pressure valve its job is to maintain the correct pressure in the evaporator to keep it from freezing up. So how I understand it is if the pressure in the evaporator gets low, then you're going to end up with the evaporator getting colder, just like if the system was low on Freon, and it'll get below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and the moisture in the air passing through it will freeze to the coil, and then it's not long after that you freeze up the whole coil, and then it's not doing anything. So this is supposed to maintain a high enough pressure in the evaporator to keep this from freezing up. So this is mostly good when it's not super hot out, and this is mostly used when it's not hot out. So if you're running this thing on a 75-degree day or something like that, the AC system's not having to work that hard, that's when this guy comes into effect, and it keeps the evaporator from getting too cold. How necessary is it? I don't know. It's the only time I've ever seen one, but I haven't messed with AC systems much at all. This guy is the expansion valve. So it's a cartridge deal that slides in here and pops out. I've already screwed up this enough, so I'm not touching it anymore. But this is what actually has the valve in it. So let me see if I can remember this right. You got Freon that's going to come in here. So this is high pressure. Comes in. There's an orifice screw thing in here, or at least that's what I think it is. And this cartridge right here slides into this housing. This is what actually has the expansion valve in it. And all the expansion valve is it's just literally just a valve that modulates how much Freon can flow through the evaporator. So finding one of these, absolutely hopeless, never gonna happen. And I think I got as close to absolutely ruining this as I possibly could. So I wanted to go through and replace O-rings. So I thought, oh, there's probably an O-ring in there. And I had this side braced, so I thought I was doing good. This side braced, this side was gently trying to take it loose. And then I heard a weird little noise. And what I didn't realize is this tube is incredibly soft, and it actually was kinking the tube up here because it was stuck to the nut. So I did my best just to, you can't even grab it with a pair of pliers without crushing it. I mean, I tried to, get it to straighten out just a little bit, and then I just quit messing with it. So hopefully that's not totally kinked closed. Otherwise, the expansion valve is never going to work. So we'll just have to figure that out later. But I didn't want to keep chancing it because it would appear I didn't actually cause a leak. So like 2.5 hours ago, this was at 16 inches of mercury, and this is mediocre at best. So the fact that this is even still holding any vacuum after 2.5 hours is impressive to me. But yeah, so I jacked that up, so there's something to be mindful of. This had an O-ring under it, so I replaced that with an R134 one. This is supposed to have an O-ring behind it, but I couldn't just readily get this to come apart, and I didn't want to break this thing any more than I already did. This had an O-ring behind it, and I actually had to just stretch the O-ring out and hold it just for a little bit before it would pop in there, because I didn't have exactly the right size, because it's probably some metric, whatever. But yeah, so that is this disaster. Is the AC gonna work? I have absolutely no idea. Okay, looking at the heater control, potentially for the last time. So I put some zip ties here to hold this whole thing up, because it was getting into an issue where this whole thing would sag down and it would screw up the geometry enough when the valve closed and the lever tried to open it again, it would just push the whole thing away instead of rotating the valve. So I just put 2 little zip ties here. I mean, it's not a lot of stress on the heater core, so thinking it'll be all right. Double check the clamps on everything, and I'll have to put the car through a few heat cycles and then come check them all again. I don't know how much this hose is gonna shrink, but pretty much every other heater core hose, radiator hose that I've experienced, after you go put it through a few heat cycles, it'll start weeping at some point because the rubber, I guess, shrinks and the clamp loosens up. But yeah, with this all up, zip tied up. I had to tweak the rod just a little bit, but you can see there it goes full. And you can hear the damper inside is actually hitting, which is what I want, because I want to make sure that there's no airflow. Well, I want to make sure that the airflow isn't bypassing somewhere. So the damper bottoms out there, and the damper also bottoms out there. So right there, that's gonna be no heat. Damper should be preventing any air through the heater core, and the valve that should be about as closed as it can get, because I'm hitting my stop that I welded on. So that is how that is gonna work, and I think it'll be pretty decent. I'm gonna put a little bit of Loctite or something on that nut, just so it's kind of a guarantee that that doesn't ever come loose. And I think what I'm also going to do is just take some super glue and go put some drops on either side of these clamps, just to try and keep all that from coming loose. But I am pretty pleased with that. All right, so to clear the AC button, I had to notch that out. And because there's no 220 power in the garage right now, I had to break out this thing. I went and fixed it up a little bit in a previous video and haven't really used it since. I really like it though. It makes a really distinct sound. It's an old Craftsman. So I threw the dash back in the car, quite literally, and I had to undo something. So in the video with the gauges, I ended up jumping this black wire to this black wire with the red stripe to bypass the rheostat. The rheostat's this guy here. It dims the interior lights. The reason I did that is because the Intellitronics gauges I installed really said they really don't like the rheostat to be used with them. They want a constant 12 volts, so that's why I originally bypassed the rheostat. What I later realized is I didn't use the ground for the lights. I used the ground for the gauge cluster for everything in the gauge cluster. So I effectively bypassed the rheostat in the gauge cluster. So I undid that jumper wire, and I'm going to end up using the rheostat because I actually realized I need it. The main thing being is I want to be able to brighten and dim the lights on this guy so I can tune it to whatever looks best. And I also, want the rest of the interior lights to dim, obviously. I think there's one for the glove box, and I know the cigarette lighter has one. So basically the way the rheostat works, kind of a summary of what I talked about in the other video, is the rheostat, it gets 12 volts, but it dims the lights off of the ground side of the lights. So this black wire with the red stripe is the ground, and the red wire with the blue stripe is 12 volts. The solid black wire is just a dedicated ground. So this wire here, the black with the red stripe, is what all the grounds for the interior lights run off of, and that's what I tied onto for these lights over here. So that's how that works. So the way I just wired it up here for testing, the pin that would be the ground, just ran it straight down to the negative on this battery, and then the red with the blue stripe is going to be the one right next to it, that pin there, and that's also where your 12 volts ties into. So you get 12 volts going to the switch, 12 volts going to all your lights, and then your ground for your lights comes back here and goes to the bottom pin, or the horizontal pin right there, the black with the red stripe. So that was how I hooked this up to test the rheostat, because the other rheostat I found out was actually broken, which sucks. But that is the wiring for this. Some other things that I did worth mentioning is, so these clamps, I mean, they're really not ideal for this. They were just some little, I think 1/4-inch clamps with a rubber insulator on them, and then I used some vacuum line, put a slit in it, wrapped it around the cable, glued those together, and then once I knew where everything was going to land, I glued everything together. So hopefully that keeps everything locked down. Also, if it wasn't obvious, For the heater core hoses, I use some copper tubing here. So like this piece here is what obviously makes the heater core hose do a 180-degree turn, because otherwise the rubber hose is never going to do that. And I flared the ends of the line. So there's a flare way up in here and down here so that the hose can't slip off of the copper pipe. So I did that, soldered it all together obviously. And then for this top port of the heater core, there is another copper line. And both of them come out right here. This is where the original heater core lines would have came out, except I don't know how close the engine's gonna have to be to the firewall, but I'm guessing it's gonna be pretty close. And right about here, I'm thinking is where the cylinder head is gonna be. So that's why I came out here, just did a 90 right off the bat and put a straight section in both of them so that hopefully this will be, well, this will have to be well above the valve cover. So hopefully those won't be in the way there and they'll be clear of the intake and the valve cover and everything. And then I'm gonna have to note, somehow stamp these, which one is which, because I wanna make sure that I put the inlet on the correct, or the hose on the correct port, because you want to fill the heater core from the bottom. That way, hopefully it purges all the air out of the top of it. So those are the copper lines that I used. And again, you can see how I flared the ends of it here so that the hose can't just slip off effortlessly. So that pretty much takes care of that. I'll have to figure out a way to mount these later once I know where they're actually going to sit. The heater core hose, because this has heater core hoses here in the cab, and they are, I mean, realistically, the only way to change them is going to be to get the dash in a similar state to what it is now and take all the HVAC stuff out of it. I didn't want to put cheap hose in it. So this is the hose that I used. I was able to get it locally, but they had to special order it. So Gates 3269S green stripe, using 5/8 because I think that'll end up being the right size for all of this. And for comparison, I have, this is just a regular generic heater core hose, also 5/8. So you can see the difference in quality between the, well, maybe not necessarily quality, but the difference in thickness between the two. This hose here is supposed to be more of like a industrial grade hose, like used on buses and large trucks and just heavier duty applications than this cheap stuff. So, I mean, this stuff's fine, but this stuff I'm hoping is going to have a really, really long lifespan before it requires me to tear the dash apart to fix it. So it is a lot stiffer. It's not going to make anywhere near as tight of a bend, but hopefully it'll end up holding up a lot better. Also, while we're here looking at this, I tried to be a little proactive in thinking about the future, and I faced all the clamps down in such a way that I will hopefully be able to get some kind of swivel socket on them in the future when they need snugged. Because what I don't want to do is have to blow all this apart just because I can't get to a hose clamp. So all the hose clamps I put facing down in such a way that hopefully I'll be able to get a tool on them. Also, with these cables, they really don't like to make tight bends, and the least bends you can have, the better. But a thing to help with that is I had some wax-based lubricant, like for bicycle chain, and I went ahead and put a decent bit of that in the cable. What I would probably recommend is, if you did something similar to this, using these cables, and you knew roughly how long of a cable you were going to need, I would go ahead and pull the inner part out of the sleeve and get a bunch of wax lubricant or something. I kind of like that because it dries in there and it's not just going to be dripping out all over the place. So I'd recommend getting some of that in there before you go through final assembly, just because once that wax lubricant worked its way in there, everything started working way better than it did before. Also with the recirculating vent, it's that guy right there. Just because of the limitations of the thing that I built, it can't go the full throw that it needs to. So when it's on recirculate, it doesn't actually completely close off the damper, and I figure that's fine. It's going to pull a little bit of outside air, which is probably better, just to make sure that there's always a little bit of fresh air coming into the car. So that was the reasoning behind that. And then this decal, I literally just designed in Microsoft Word, and I've had to do a couple test prints, but I was able to print it off on a large sheet of paper. And once I got it kind of the placements figured out the way I liked with the paper, then I took it to a decal shop, actually the same decal shop that did the one for the 68 GMC's air filter. That turned out real good. And they went ahead and printed me a few of these, and then I just put it on there and cut it out, obviously. So the kind of a problem with this, though, is they had, in order for these bits to be clear, they had to use a clear or transparent decal to start with, and then they printed black. Everything that's black is what was actually printed. The problem with that is it's not totally opaque. It's a little bit transparent still, and it just didn't look right, especially with the lights behind it. So you can kind of see some of it poking through here, some of that green tape. So what I actually did is I went and covered the whole back of this thing in a layer of electrical tape, and then I used a little knife and cut out as best I could perfect little squares around each word, just, you know, fit as tight as I could. So that way it blacks out everything that needs to be blacked out. And then to soften the light just a little bit more, I put some like 2 or 3 layers of green painter's tape on the back of this thing just to soften the light and give it more of a green glow. So that actually worked out pretty decent. We'll see how it holds up in the long run. For screws, I couldn't come up with anything too creative, so I just went with these coarse threaded whatever square drive screw, put them on an angle. I think it looks pretty decent. This is the original fan switch. Again, just went ahead and mounted it on here. This button here is going to be for the air conditioning, because originally I thought I was being really clever and I used the original limit switch and mounted it on this lever so that when you went to full cool, it would hit that switch and turn the AC on. Initially seemed like a good idea until I realized, you know, it's kind of nice to have the AC on and not have it blowing full blast cold all the time. Because as soon as you wanted it to be a little bit warmer, it would totally shut the AC off, and that realistically is just going to be a problem. So that's what this dedicated button is for. So this just does the damper, and this button here you can manually turn on the air conditioning with, and it lights up green. There's a little green halo around the actual button that's built into the button, and whenever you engage it, that's going to light up green, signifying that the AC compressor is energized. So there is that. Went ahead and got the cigarette lighter in here too. It's the original one to the car, and this actually glows as well. It has a light in there that shines and it reflects up through the symbol here. And I think what I'm going to do, this originally was it had a little lever to balance out the sound for the speakers. And I'm going to get rid of that, and I'm going to try and put another similar to this cigarette lighter over here, just because I don't have anything else to put there, and it makes way more sense to have a cigarette lighter there just to have an extra port for power in the car. Here is the setup for the lights. So you can see the bulb right behind where that hole is drilled into the piece of metal. This little metal bracket here runs down and ties into a screw down here on this side. And I just scuffed everything up, and I used a quick setting epoxy just to get everything where it would hold together enough that I could epoxy it for real. And then I put JB Weld on top of that and let it cure for a full day. And that seems to have worked pretty good. This guy, you can see the same deal, has a little metal bracket up there. So the pigtails for the lights are glued to the metal, and then the metal is glued to the actual plastic of the interior. So I put a light behind each of the words on the decal. so that it can go ahead and just shine on through there. And then you can see the back of this, what I was talking about, where there's that green tape just to kind of make the light just a little bit softer so it's not just so obnoxiously bright. But that's pretty much that. Had to do a little bit of trimming. I think these are T1 bulbs, maybe. Real tiny little bulb. It's the same type of bulb that all the other things like the cigarette lighter used. So that was pretty convenient. As far as changing these ones ought to be pretty easy to change. These ones are going to be a hassle. I'm going to have to figure out how to get to that screw. But realistically, I mean, they're going to last. They should last a long time, so I'm not too worried about it. But yeah, and then the mounting screws for this, they just thread into the plastic because, I mean, it's already cut up anyways, and it's going to be covered up, so it ought to be fine. So that is how all the lights are mounted. And I think this is the last thing here. So the lights that I bought had these little pigtails on them, which were pretty nice. And I couldn't come up with a good way of soldering or putting them all together. And I used some of these, I think they're called Wago or Wago, however you want to say it, connectors. So you can pull this orange tab up and it'll unlock the wire. So if you need to add something or remove something, you can really easily. And they're used for AC wiring in houses. So I figure probably 0.2 of an amp, I'm guessing, that this pulls ought to be plenty safe with these connectors. And this is really nice for testing because when I had this hooked up to the dimmer switch earlier, I just unclipped the actual wiring harness for the car and just clipped in some jumper wires that I could run to the battery. So that's how I tied all the wires together. I think it turned out pretty decent. So that, I think, is going to be this done. Off and on, I've worked on this for what feels like forever, but I am decently happy enough with it to move on to something else. I think it'll end up being pretty good and looking decent once the car's all together. At 40 minutes long, that was way longer than I really wanted it to be, but it's hard for me to gauge what is going to potentially be helpful to somebody or not, and ultimately, these are just to document the project and not necessarily be entertaining, so it's kind of a give and take thing. Good news, though. There's some foreshadowing as to what's going to be going on here pretty quick. So, probably not the very next video on this thing, but coming up soon should be figuring out how to get the motor and transmission in it, and what motor and transmission is going in it. So, I think I'm finally at a point where I need to move on to that phase of the project, so I'm looking forward to that. Thanks.